Solar Bear Plunge by Jason A. Bartles. Read by Emmie Christie. I deserved to bathe in filth, and today the solar bears were cheering me to do just that. I walked toward the edge of the 22nd Street overpass where, a few feet below, the oily waters of the Vine Street Canal blinded me with the reflection of the midday sun. The backs of my knees wobbled, and I retreated, but Mike's hands caught my shoulder and waist. They were cool, refreshing even, against my bare skin. Nothing like my father's calloused hands. Nothing like them at all. Mike guided me to the ledge. "You ready, Charlie?" he asked with his round cheeks turned up in a smile. I stood up on my toes to peer into the canal. An empty Wawa cup and clumps of feathers bobbed in the slow current. Foamy splotches gurgled up from the depths, while shadows churned below the surface. The liquid ranged in hue from oxidized avocado to rain-soaked cardboard. I shook my head and clutched the metal railing. "Careful now," he said, and peeled my hands away before they burned. He draped a stained towel over the banister. "You don't want any open wounds when you dive into those waters." "I think you mean sludge," I muttered. Mike gave my shoulder a squeeze, but otherwise ignored my complaint. He flashed a thumbs up to the small crowd standing behind us on the desolate overpass. The diverse group was united by their matching honey-colored shorts and umber tank tops with the logo of a cartoonish bear wearing swim goggles. The Solar Bears had formed in Philadelphia about a decade prior. Their mission was to provide housing and a safe place to settle for displaced queers. In addition to social activities, they met twice a week to clean up a park or lobby City Hall for solar voucher programs. It was a niche group, but one that served a real need for those of us escaping from ravaged environments or hostile families. I had run from both. In south-central Pennsylvania, heat waves baked apples on the trees long before the harvest, and cornfields withered into mazes months too early for Halloween. Jobs were scarce, and the thought of joining my father at the plastics factory was unbearable. But mostly I fled because he believed loving me meant outlawing my right to marry another man. There was no turning back now. Wearing a neon yellow Speedo and matching cap, but no goggles, I felt like a fishing lure about to be cast into the depths. I climbed the concrete barrier, threw one leg over the towel-covered bars, and straddled the railing. I didn't know what was worse, my vertigo, the smell of cat piss and day-old cheesesteaks, or the proximity of Giardia. I looked over my shoulder, squinting to find July. They were the first person I met in the city and the one to introduce me to the Solar Bears. "You've got this, Charlie," shouted July, noticing my hesitation. The other Solar Bears cheered me on, too. "Let's go, Charlie, let's go!" Each of them had been initiated by plunging into the sludge, and they survived. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad, I thought, as I teetered above the canal. Mike helped me balance as I swung my other leg over the railing. My toes dangled over the concrete ledge that jutted out a few inches. To my left, the outdated road sign pointing the way to Valley Forge and I-76 West creaked in the warm breeze. One big jump, a murky splash into the flooded expressway, and I'd be one of them. "I'm ready," I said. Mike released my hand, and I raised my arms over my head. Then he thumped his chest with his right hand, shimmied his hips, and cried out, "Solar Bears!" 2 beats later, and perfectly in sync, the others thumped and shimmied and cried out, "Take that, plunge!" On their mark, I took a deep breath, and squatted for leverage, and thrust as hard and as high as I could. I tucked my knees and rolled into a somersault that severed the burdensome strings I had dragged behind me. The shouts of the Solar Bears slowed in my ears. I could have spun headfirst in the open air for ages, taking in the suddenly sweet smell of honeysuckle as crystal-clear waters shimmered above my head. The world slowly rotated, and as it realigned, I straightened my legs, clenched every muscle in my body, and squeezed my eyes tight. The silken waters billowed around me, and gravity loosened its grip from the nape of my neck. I descended gently, further than expected. I waved my arms in every direction. I tried butterfly kicks and frog legs to reverse course, but I kept sinking. Nothing resisted the force of my frantic movements. I was floating, but downward, no longer due to the momentum of the plunge. I needed to gather my bearings. Maybe I had flipped upside down and was headed toward the surface. I did not want to open my eyes in these sewage-filled waters, but I had no choice. Soon I would need to breathe, and the longer I stayed, the worse the inevitable ailments would be. I took a quick peek. Daylight pierced my eyes. I squinted and blinked in search of shade. As my sight adjusted, I realized I hovered mere inches above the old Vine Street Expressway, but there was no water, no sludge, no trash or puke anywhere to be found. Blades of grass tickled my toes as I alighted on the landscaped median. "Breathe, my dear Charlie," said a muffled voice. I turned to find a man who could have been Mike's father or grandfather standing behind me. He had the same round cheeks, weathered with time. "Take a breath. It's okay." His words reverberated in my skull as if I were hearing him underwater, but we appeared to be surrounded by air. He placed a familiar hand on my shoulder. I forced my lungs to inhale, as if taking a first breath with a snorkel, expecting to choke, but crisp air flooded my lungs. I unclenched my body. "Where am I?" I asked between gasps. "Take it all in. We don't have much time before you resurface." He spun me around, and as I caught my breath, I surveyed the former expressway. Along the wide expanse, there were no cars or tractor-trailers. The eastbound roadways, paved in rubber, provided multiple lanes for the different needs of bikers, folks in wheelchairs, and others taking a casual stroll. Oak trees, maples, and dogwoods in full bloom lined the median, forming a protective barrier for the knolls that spread along the westbound lanes. Beside me was a plaque marking the start of a walking memorial dedicated to the historic sections of Chinatown that were razed when the expressway was first built, and to the 19th century cemetery of the First African Baptist Church unearthed during its construction. 2 blocks ahead of me, a waterfall poured over a small dam into a deep channel, apparently converting the floodwaters of the Schuylkill into electricity while diverting them from the parkway. Families and friends gathered at picnic tables shaded by stained solar grass umbrellas, while others bathed in the sun. The concrete walls were matted in mosses and succulents. From repurposed pipes, split long ways and mounted, grew fresh lettuces and herbs. A young parent held up their child to pluck a few leaves, obviously free for the taking, which they tucked inside their hoagies. I traced the tubing from those planters toward rainwater collection barrels up on the overpass where I had jumped. The solar bears were nowhere to be found. Instead, a drone labeled Urgent Care zipped through the air on its way to provide medical assistance. Tiny birds chirped from every direction. All around me, generative and interconnected, life thrived in community with the built environment. Feeling dizzy, I stared at this uncanny Mike, my mouth agape, searching for the words to demand an explanation. He simply raised his eyebrow and smiled. Then he waved goodbye. Suddenly weightless, I lifted off the soft grass. I tried to push myself back down, not ready to leave. I looked up at the shimmering surface rushing toward me, and before I knew it, my head burst through the muck of the Vine Street Canal. I paddled as quickly as I could toward the ladder Mike had lowered, and I climbed out. My skin was slick with grease, and gunk tarnished my Speedo. I plucked a slimy tendril from my waist and flicked it over the railing. "Well?" asked Mike. He slid his fingers under the swimming cap and removed it with care. "Tell us what you saw." Before I could answer, July rushed to my side and doused me in warm, soapy water. They delighted a bit too much in hosing me off, before handing me a clean towel. The other solar bears gathered to hear what I would say. "I'm not sure," I said after drying my face. It ended before I could even make sense of it. It already feels like a distant memory fading into sepia. "Charlie saw it," Mike confirmed to the other solar bears. They slapped one another on the back and gave out high fives. "I didn't know there were so many shades of green and purple. I want to go back." I looked over my shoulder at the rotten waters flooding the old expressway, desperate to dive again. My ears flushed. What was that? Some impossible fantasy world? Why would you even show me that? No, my dear Charlie. Each time one of us plunges into the canal, we get a glimpse of a distant future. It's only impossible if we believe it is. If we can't imagine a path towards something better than what we currently have. I don't get it, I said. Maybe this had all been a mistake, I thought. It's true, said July as they tousled my damp hair. By no means is it guaranteed we will get there, but you saw a future that is still attainable. Hold on to that vision, Charlie, and one day it might reappear in all its vibrant hues. Mike paused. Then he said, "If," and his voice trailed off in anticipation. I stopped to really hear his words. I took a moment to look around at this little queer community standing on the edge of an overpass, my new friends, and I began to understand. I had experienced a world yet to be created. "If I build it," I said. Mike shook his head. "If we build it," he replied, pointing to each of the Solar Bears, and we all nodded in agreement. Then he handed me a tank top and shorts, and officially welcomed me as the newest inductee of the Solar Bears. July wrapped their arms around me, and the others squished me with a big group hug. July began to bounce, low and from the knees, and soon the others followed their lead. The collective energy rippled toward me. They all stood tall, releasing their embrace, but staying in formation as they jumped in a circle around me. Mike signaled me with a raised eyebrow. I know exactly what to do, I thought. Once, then twice, I thumped my chest. Leftward, then right, I shimmied my hips. And surrounded by my new fam, I cried out to the sunny skies, "Solar Bears!" Thump, thump, shimmy, shimmy. Take that plunge!
Welcome to Utopia Science Fiction, the podcast. I am here with our design editor, Jonathan, and today we are discussing serial writing versus episodic writing. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello.
So, do you want to start us off with an overview of serial writing versus episodic writing?
Episodic storytelling is sort of a loosely connected series of stories, mostly connected by things like the characters or the setting. Most famously, the original Star Trek, Lost in Space after the first few episodes, the Cthulhu mythos, if you want sort of a literary example, since H.P. Lovecraft is sort of just loose telling or writing a bunch of stories which had similar concepts and would occasionally name drop elements from previous stories he had done. Serialized storytelling is basically, it's a longer story that's broken up into a series of shorter stories. Battlestar Galactica, most of New Star Trek, Discovery, Picard, Deep Space Nine attempted it a few times. Babylon 5, and of course a lot of classic novels started out as serials that were published weekly or monthly.
Like
the
Charles Dickens,
Yeah.
Famous for those serials.
Mm-hmm. And H.G. Wells as well.
So what are the strengths and weaknesses for writing a serialized story?
I'd say it kind of has the best of both worlds. You can tell a longer story, but you can break it up into more digestible chunks. So, people can keep following along with the larger story, but also feel satisfied that they've read or watched a full, complete story.
What came to mind was there's like part 5 Atlantis stories, where you, at the end of an episode, you don't get necessarily a conclusion. Sometimes it runs on too much into the next episode, so it's not self-contained.
Yeah, I mean, we'll probably be getting into more of the technique about this, but a lot of serialized fiction, you either end the episode on a cliffhanger, or at the very least you plant a seed for the next or a later installment.
So what are some of the weaknesses to serial writing?
The main disadvantage, your audience has to start at or near the beginning, or they will have no real context as to what's going on. And if it gets released out of order, which is a problem a lot of televised serials ran into early on. Babylon 5 suffered from this. Firefly. In fact, I think Firefly, they ended up airing the pilot as last or next to last.
I feel like, you probably had this problem way back when, too, when you picked up a magazine and you started reading Charles Dickens and you realized that you've missed the past 5 or 6 issues and you have no idea what's happening. So it's an age-old problem, I think, with serialization.
Yeah, and it's one of the most frequent excuses that studio executives would give.
So what are some of the strengths and weaknesses to episodic writing? I think you highlighted one of them was that, character growth through the episode after episode is not present, doesn't always carry over. Are there other strengths and weaknesses?
I'd say for the advantage to episodic is that you can be a lot more experimental and flexible. This isn't to say that serialized can't be experimental.
So I feel like episodic writing is more based on the idea, exploring the idea like a morality play, and serial is more character driven, where you're following the character arc rather than necessarily the plot line. Plays into it, but does not play into it as much as the character development.
I do somewhat agree, but serialized can also delve a lot deeper into a concept, because serialized storytelling relies on consequences. So one of my main issues with episodic storytelling is so often they'll introduce something that should have a major impact on the setting or the characters, and it pretty much gets ignored from that point on. For example, the TNG episode Force of Nature, where we learn that warp drive is destroying subspace, as sort of an allegory for fossil fuels. And, well, it came up for that episode and was very quickly written out because the writers realized we've introduced something that we can't really deal with, because the implications on that are massive.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of chickened out. And of course, with episodic storytelling, there is only so much you could do. But with more serialized format, they could have at least had a few episodes dedicated to...
My theory is that even episodic writing does have some kind of serial element to it. It's just not usually as pronounced. So I think usually there's a spectrum between episodic and super serialized stories, and a lot of things fall in the middle. And I feel like a lot of things we think of as episodic actually fall kind of into serial. Even in like Star Trek Voyager, there were a couple things, not many, but there were a couple things that would go over into episodes later on, like the mobile emitter for the Doctor's character.
The Doctor is actually a great example, because at the beginning, being a medical holographic program, he is just a program. But over time, he sort of grows and develops and becomes a person.
So I kind of draw this parallel between episodic writing is more like a short story, and serial writing is more like a longer novel or a novella.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair comparison, especially considering that a lot of adaptations from books recently have been serialized TV series, which makes a lot of sense to me. The Lord of the Rings trilogy is a really good movie series, but so much had to be dropped to make it just a 3 or 4 hour long movie just for the Fellowship of the Ring.
Oh yeah.
Several characters just got completely ignored and abandoned because they just didn't have the time.
Conversely, The Hobbit was not necessarily meant to be 3 movies. They added too many things and characters, and it was like they were overcompensating for The Lord of the Rings, missing a few characters.
Yeah. Having seen the first 2 parts, I quite enjoyed them, but anyway, back on topic. In making your decision as to whether to go episodic or serialized, if you have several ideas that could be connected, at least loosely, and you feel like you'd like to explore how your characters might react to radically different situations, that's probably best for episodic. And if you have an idea that for a longer narrative, but you have room for multiple different stories within it, then that's better for serialized.
Yeah, that's a good point. My advice is, when doing a serialized story, always pay very, very careful attention to what kind of cereal you're using and what brand, like General Mills, Kellogg. I think, jokes aside, episodic is good if you don't want to worry about keeping track of all of the long-term implications. If you want someone to be able to pick up a story and just read it and enjoy it, like a short story, then episodic is the best writing. But if you want a longer, more drawn-out thing, something that someone's going to have to start with from the beginning and read in order, serialization offers a lot more opportunity to explore various different aspects of the same strain.
Yeah, so some examples for episodic, if you're doing like a planet hopping adventure series, or it could be island hopping if it's more of a historical or fantasy situation. But if you want to explore like politics or war, survival stories, then that's probably better for serialized storytelling.
So I do feel like it's worth maybe ending on the note, or worth mentioning, that there can be some very, very poignant episodic writing. That, just because something is episodic doesn't mean that it's not very well done. I'm thinking of the Inner Light by Next Generation, but also some of the short stories by people like Edmund Hamilton, where, you're just in and then you're out, but that still leaves a lasting impression.
That's true.
So I am going to say that is all the time that we have left for today, but thank you for joining us, and we'll see you all next time.
All right.
You've been listening to Utopia Science Fiction, the podcast. Our story today was Solar Bear Plunge by Jason Bartles, read by the talented Emmie Christie. If you like what you heard today and would like to continue supporting Utopia Science Fiction, the podcast, in both our audio performances and in publishing, please consider subscribing to our Patreon. Just click the link below. And you too could become part of the invaluable team which helps make what we do possible. A special thanks to those already subscribed to our Patreon, and to our Kickstarter supporters who donated during our February 2022 campaign. And now, let us join in our usual refrain. Dear friends, dear listeners, let us go onward, ever onward, onward through the impossible.